Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the causes of the American Revolution. This video will be divided into two parts. The first part will discuss the British policies that led to the American Revolution, and the second part will discuss the colonial responses to those policies. Okay, let's get started. The first cause of the American Revolution was the French and Indian War. It was called the French and Indian War because it was Britain against the French and Indians. They were fighting over land in the Ohio River Valley. After 7 years, Britain won the war. The French and Indian War is important for two reasons. First, Britain issued the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763 forbid the colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. This upset the colonists because they felt that since they fought for this land, it was their right to be able to settle there. The second reason the French and Indian War is important is because the war left Britain heavily in debt. This meant that Britain would have to find ways to pay back that war debt, and as we'll see, Britain wanted to force the colonists to help pay it back. This brings us to the second cause of the American Revolution. King George III thought that the colonists should help pay back the war debt. As a result, King George III and the British Parliament began enacting a series of tax policies. First was the Sugar Act, which was a tax on sugar. However, the colonists began protesting and boycotting, so the Sugar Act was repealed and the Stamp Act was enacted. The Stamp Act was a tax on all paper products like stamps, legal documents, and playing cards. Again, the colonists began petitioning the king, protesting, and boycotting. So the Stamp Act was repealed and the Townshend Acts were enacted. The Townshend Acts were an import tax. Import just means bringing something into the country, and the tax was on things like lead and paint. Yet again, the colonists became more and more enraged about the taxes, so the Townshend Acts were repealed and the Tea Act was enacted. The Tea Act only allowed a single tea company to sell tea, the East India Tea Company, which meant the colonists were no longer allowed to sell tea. Many colonists smuggled tea into the colonies to sell to support their families. The Tea Act made it so the colonists could no longer make a living, which obviously upset them. The colonists responded by dumping hundreds of chests filled with British tea into the Boston Harbor, which is known as the Boston Tea Party. The third cause of the American Revolution were the British policies that infringed on the colonists' individual liberties. That just means some of the colonists' freedoms and rights were taken away. The first policy was called the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act allowed British soldiers to live on the colonists' houses and without the colonists' permission. Think about how upset you would be if a bunch of soldiers showed up at your house today and said, "We will be living here for a while, you can just sleep on the floor." The second infringement were the writs of assistance. In effect, these writs allowed British officials to unfairly search the colonists' homes. To recap, the combination of the French and Indian War, British taxation, and the British policies that took away the colonists' liberties were all causes of the American Revolution and led to the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, now that we've talked about the British policies that led to the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, let's talk about how the colonists responded to those policies. First, it's important to understand why the colonists were so upset about British taxation. The big key word in this section that you should remember is no taxation without representation. We will discuss what that means in a moment. So why were the colonists upset about the taxes? Most countries must have taxes for the country to survive. Taxes are how we pay for things like school, roads, and the police. Without taxes, our country would fall apart. So if a country must tax to survive, why were the colonists so upset? The colonists said they were being taxed but weren't represented in the British Parliament. This was known as no taxation without representation. So what does that mean? The way that it normally occurred in Britain was that a group of people were elected to represent the country and participate in the decision-making process. They would come together to think of ideas and then share those ideas with each other, and those ideas would eventually become laws. However, the colonists were not allowed to participate in Parliament. They were not allowed to share their ideas. They were not allowed to be included in the lawmaking process. The colonies did not have any people representing them in their interests. It wasn't fair to be taxed but not have a voice in it. To summarize, the British colonists were upset with the taxation because they were being taxed but not represented. The colonists were not allowed to vote for people to go to Britain so they could have their voices heard. Now that we understand what no taxation without representation means, let's talk about how the colonists responded to the British policies. The colonists petitioned the king, they protested, and they boycotted. In this context, a petition was a written request to the king asking for political change. The colonists were saying either repeal those taxes, take them all away, or let us be represented in Parliament. The colonists also staged a number of protests. We normally think of a protest as a group of people coming together and holding up signs for the type of change they want to see. Here, for example, it would be to change the tax policies. They also engaged in other forms of protest, like publishing things in colonial newspapers that expressed their dissatisfaction. Finally, the colonists also began boycotting British goods like clothes, knives, and kitchen utensils. And boycott just means the refusal to buy products from Britain. To summarize, the colonists did not immediately declare independence and go to war with Britain. First, they wrote petitions to the king asking for political change, and they also staged protests and boycotted British goods. It wasn't until after all the petitions, the protests, and the boycotts fell on deaf ears that protests turned into rebellion and rebellion into revolution. Now let's talk about a few of the major events during this time. The first major event during this time was the Boston Massacre. Here's what happened. One night, a group of colonists began verbally harassing the British troops who were stationed in their cities. They would yell things at the soldiers like, "Hey, you scallywag!" However, that verbal harassment led to physical harassment. The colonists began throwing things like snowballs and rocks at the troops. Eventually, as the colonists and troops began to face off, the British troops shot and killed 5 colonists. The event was depicted as a massacre and has become to be known as the Boston Massacre. The second major event was the Boston Tea Party. As we discussed, the colonists were upset about the Tea Act. In response, a group called the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Native Americans, boarded the British ships in Boston Harbor, and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the Boston Harbor. In today's money, it was worth millions of dollars. The Boston Tea Party made King George so mad that he created what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts did things like close down the Boston Harbor, dissolved colonial legislatures, and suspended trial by jury. The third major event was Thomas Paine's pamphlet called Common Sense. A pamphlet's just like a small book. In it, Thomas Paine essentially wrote that it was common sense for the colonists to declare independence from Britain and make their own country. Thomas Paine did not agree with how Britain was treating its people who were living in the colony. Common sense was a huge deal because Thomas Paine wrote it in plain English so regular people could understand it. It persuaded many people that declaring independence was a good idea. Finally, as the American Revolution had begun and some battles fought, the colonists officially wrote the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was like a breakup letter from a girlfriend to a boyfriend. We will learn more about what the Declaration means, but essentially it said, "We do not like the way you've been treating us. This is a bad relationship and you aren't taking care of our needs, so we're breaking up with you and making our own country." They said, "We're going to call our country the United States of America." And that's how the United States was formed. There were a series of British policies and a series of colonial reactions, all of which led up to the American Revolution and the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Thanks, everyone.